1918 is remembered as the year when the fighting in the Great War stopped and the Allies proclaimed victory. Yet more than 10 months of the year would pass before this happened. During those 10 months, Brandon residents were not sure if the Allies would win or lose, or even if the war might carry on into 1919. They also faced their own daily battles. First, there were food shortages, followed by rationing. The age range for conscription increased to include men aged 50 to 55. Soon there would be no men left in Brandon to labour in the fields and factories. If that wasn't enough, a new and deadly threat visited Brandon. As the war entered its fourth year, Brandon residents were hit hard by food shortages. To ensure there was enough food to go round, the Ministry of Food from central government introduced the rationing of certain foods, such as sugar, margarine and meat. The meat ration included 6 ounces of venison or horse flesh, meaning the horses that had driven the town's economy for as long as anyone could remember, pulling ploughs, transporting people, timber and other goods across town, were then considered a legitimate source of nutrition. The availability of meat became scarce, although the Ministry of Food advised Brandon Council that rabbit meat could be used as a supplement to residents' diet, although only 10 ounces of skinned rabbit and offal were allowed under the rationing scheme. The council replied saying that rabbits were indeed plentiful around town, but alas, with all the men now serving in the army, there was a lack of anyone experienced in trapping them. The wealthy landowners were in no mood to allow poachers on their land, and they prosecuted anyone found trespassing in pursuit of the rabbits. Robert Cole and Samuel Williams found out at their cost, literally, when they were apprehended on a country estate in Santon Downham and fined £2 and £1 respectively. Brandon's council had wide-reaching powers to enforce the price capping of essential foods, which put them at loggerheads with local farms and butchers. Following fears that a local farm was selling milk too expensively, they put a cap on all milk sold in Brandon, twopence and halfpenny if the customer went to the farm to collect it, or threepence if it was delivered. However, the East Anglian Stock Farms Limited were none too pleased, so in February their manager, William Wortley, announced that his business was going to cease selling milk to Brandon residents. The council's reaction was to draw up plans to requisition the milk by force if need be. Then, a couple of months later, after receiving similar threats from other milk sellers, the council relented, raised the price cap by half a penny, thus averting confrontation over the milk. This was not the end of the conflict between Brandon and the East Anglian Stock Farms Limited. Far from it. Brandon's War Agricultural Committee, made up of Brandon councillors and led by Frederick Gentle, who incidentally owned his own farm supplying milk to his butcher shop on Brandon High Street, prosecuted the East Anglian Stock Farms Limited because it seemed one of their farms, Lime Kiln Farm, had not stored corn correctly, thus allowing it to become covered in green mould. Food was a valuable commodity that could not be wasted, and those who did not appreciate this had to be punished. It is also worth noting that Mr. Gentle also owned his own dairy, so he could be considered a direct rival of the farm. However, Mr. Gentle and his colleagues had not bargained on the East Anglian Stock Farms Limited, hiring the services of a top lawyer from London. The lawyer stated that the law demanded any legal action had a deadline of 6 months, and as the committee were trying to prosecute his client 8 months after the alleged incident, then the case should be dismissed. The committee had no option but to follow the lawyer's instruction and dismissed all charges. In the spring of 1918, the German army launched a very successful spring offensive in Flanders and were sweeping the Allies aside. If this continued, they might even win the war. The last thing our lads in France needed to hear was those prisoners of war being held in Britain were escaping and trying to find their way home. So it was rather fortuitous that in April, John Caban, a Brandon hairdresser, apprehended 2 German POWs in Brandon Park. It seems the prisoners had escaped from a POW camp near Thetford. With the Germans on the offensive, residents may have been forgiven for wondering if Britain was now, almost after 4 years, going to lose the war. The British government's reaction was to increase the age of enlistment. Men up to the age of 50 or 55, if they were physically fit, were to be enlisted into service and take on labouring roles in logistics, building, dockyards and all manner of other industries. This would then free up younger men already doing those vital tasks to go into the trenches. In all fairness, you would have been hard pressed to see a strong young lad working on any Brandon farm or sawmill in 1918. Most, if not all, were already away fighting in the war. Throughout 1918, the conscription of able-bodied men continued at pace. War tribunals sat in Brandon to hear men argue their case against not going to war. Even in the weeks leading up to the armistice, the tribunals heard from men aged in their 40s who had been called up. 2 steam engine drivers, a tobacconist, a boot repairer, a pub landlord, even a 51-year-old labourer were all called up and argued their case in front of the tribunal. Montague Froud, a Brandon builder and undertaker, aged 44, was called up but argued that he would not go to war because God is king and I acknowledge no other. Ironically, an insurance agent who was also Brandon's part-time army recruiting officer also refused to go to war when he received his call-up papers. Despite all the doom and gloom, Brandon still did its utmost to raise funds for charity. In July, Colonel Boyd Hamilton of Brandon House officially opened the first permanent cinema in Brandon. Stanley Lingwood, who had been medically discharged out of the army just the previous year, bought a little wooden cinema and sited it at the bottom of his family's home along the avenue. He named it the Electric Picture House. Proceeds from his first screening went to the Red Cross, a charity that cared for him as he lay wounded in hospital. July also saw one of the first reported deaths in Brandon from the influenza pandemic, when Mary Armiger, aged 29, died on the 17th. The deadly virus would eventually take 2 years to sweep round the world, leaving up to 50 million people dead in its wake. It was predominantly Brandon's young women who suffered. Daisy Crocker of Ford Farm and Dorothy Page of London Road both died of the virus. Perhaps most tragic was Esme Mount, daughter of Frederick Mount, the owner of the whiting business on Thetford Road. She went to school on Friday without showing any symptoms, fell ill on Saturday and died on Sunday. In November, the mortality rate in Brandon spiked at 14. Most, although not all, were down to influenza. The virus fed on people having close contact, a fact not lost on Brandon schools, which reacted immediately by closing down. Initially, they felt just a few days would be sufficient, but as the epidemic hung around, the schools stayed shut for over a month. Brandon's poor housing did not offer much help either. The council were already making plans to build more social housing after the war, but one case brought before magistrates in September demonstrated how bad it was getting. Robert Cole, he of the rabbit poaching incident earlier in the year, was renting a 2-bedroom cottage on Low Street for his family of 11. His circumstance may have been extreme, but shows us how bad the housing was for those on poor wages. If a virus wanted to spread, then these were the ideal conditions. It was not only the residents of Brandon who suffered from influenza. Our lad serving overseas suffered too. Mrs. Docking of Foster Cottages, Berry Road, received a telegram stating her husband was seriously ill from the virus. 3 days later, another telegram stated he had deteriorated to a critical condition in hospital. A third telegram brought the sad news that he had died. Robert Docking was aged 24 and had been serving in the Middle East. In September, one Brandon soldier returned to town against a backdrop of much pomp and ceremony, although not in the circumstance he and the people of Brandon would have wished for. Edgar Johnson had been wounded in the fighting of Flanders, so badly in fact that he was placed on hospital ship to come back to Britain for specialist treatment. Sadly, Edgar died while the ship was crossing the Channel. Edgar's body was brought back to Brandon for burial, and he has the distinction of being the only Brandon soldier to die in conflict and be buried in the town cemetery. Then, on Monday, 11th of November, at 11 a.m, the fighting stopped. In the days leading up to it, Germany had asked for an armistice. She was broken and could no longer fight on. Mind you, Britain and France were also broken, but Germany had simply asked for peace before they did, meaning Germany had lost the war rather than Britain winning it. Nonetheless, celebrations erupted in Brandon. St. Peter's church bells, silent throughout the war, rang out loudly, 720 times in fact, with bell ringers from Thetford doing the honours. Flags and bunting appeared outside homes and shops. Children also took flags and ran around town waving them. If a child could not get hold of a flag, then they ran around with coloured ribbons in the air. Some children with access to musical instruments sounded them as loudly as they could. In the evening, bonfires and fireworks could be seen all around town. Workers at the town's factory were given the day off as a paid holiday, something that was unheard of previously. A Thanksgiving service was conducted at St. Peter's Church, where the first money, £10, 14 shillings and 8p, was raised towards a permanent war memorial. It was also announced that with immediate effect, the enlistment of men into the army would be suspended. Men then returned home from the war. Cecil Crocker was reported to be the first POW to return back to Brandon. A work depot was created at the Church Institute, where wounded ex-soldiers could be given work or training to help them rehabilitate into everyday Brandon life. Even the gas lights, which had been turned off throughout the war, could now be turned back on. There was a real hope that the land would now be a place fit for heroes. The reality was far from it. A shortage of coal and labourers to produce the gas for Brandon's street lights meant they did not come on immediately. Jobs were not readily available. Many farms and businesses had simply disappeared during the war because no one was here to work in them. A meeting at the Ram Hotel saw 20 men from Brandon's timber industry join a trade union. Brandon's trade union membership before the war was very low, but now those who did find work demanded a fairer system than was in place before the war. After all, they had been the ones to go to war and put their lives on the line, so why should they allow the old order, who'd stayed at home, to control how they led their lives now? It had been accepted before the war, but not now. The promise of a land fit for heroes was now being called in. Brandon's branch of the Labour political party voted in a new chairman, Mr. Newton, who set about taking on Brandon's Linkheath Trust. The trust had recently imposed a new application process so they could decide who should receive charitable handouts. Mr. Newton believed this to be unfair, and so he challenged them. Over 100 residents stood behind him in his action. Resentment simmered beyond the Linkheath Trust argument. The following year, in 1919, shocked newspapers across Britain featured Brandon in their pages. A disabled war veteran had been assaulted by a Brandon councillor. Hundreds of people had gathered on the town's high street. A riot broke out and there were threats to kill. Brandon had seen the back of warfare, but now a new battle of the social order was going to be fought out.